All right, let's dive right into a really fascinating Supreme Court case from 1953. This one's all about loyalty, betrayal, and what happens when someone is accused of siding with the enemy during wartime, specifically during the Japanese occupation in World War II. So here's how we're going to break this down. We'll start with the accusation itself, then look at the two very different stories told in court. We'll get into the core questions that judges had to wrestle with, what the Supreme Court finally decided, and, most importantly, why they decided it. And then we'll wrap up with the legal principles that this case left behind. Okay, so it all starts with a man named Aquilino Villanueva. He was a Filipino citizen, and he was accused of treason, one of the most serious crimes you can commit against your country. The accusations were about things he allegedly did during that really dark period of the Japanese occupation. Now, this case didn't just happen overnight. Not at all. You can see here it was a long journey through the justice system. The alleged acts happened way back in 1944, and it took until 1953, after going through court after court, for the Supreme Court to hand down its final decision. All right, now we get to the heart of it. Every trial is basically a clash of two different stories, and this one is a perfect example. The court had a huge job to listen to both sides and figure out where the truth actually was. So, on one side, you have the prosecution's version of events. They claimed Villanueva was an active collaborator, that he helped Japanese soldiers make arrests, that he led a pro-Japanese group called the Makapili, and even patrolled with them. But on the other side, you have his defense, which was a complete denial. He said, "Nope, wasn't me. I wasn't even in that town. I was working as a tinsmith somewhere else, and the group I led was religious, not military." Two totally different realities. So, with two completely opposite stories on the table, the courts had to get laser-focused. They needed to figure out the key legal questions, what lawyers call the issues of the case, to cut through the noise and reach a fair decision. And it really all boiled down to these two massive questions. First, based on all the evidence, was this guy, Aquilino Villanueva, actually guilty of treason? And second, if the answer to that is yes, then what's the right punishment, according to the law, for what he did? So the first court gave him a sentence called reclusion temporelle. What does that mean? Well, it's a specific prison sentence, anywhere from 12 to 20 years. But then the case went up to the Court of Appeals, and they thought, you know what, that's not enough. They recommended a much tougher sentence, reclusion perpetua, which is basically life in prison. So the case makes its way all the way to the top, to the Supreme Court. This is the final word, the end of the line. After reviewing everything, they were ready to make the final call. So what did they decide? Well, first things first. On the main question of guilt, the Supreme Court was clear. They looked at all the facts and sided with the lower courts. Yes, Aquilino Villanueva was guilty of treason. The conviction was affirmed. But, and this is a huge but, they did not go along with the Court of Appeals' recommendation for a harsher penalty. They upheld the original sentence, 16 years and 1 day. So while the conviction stood, the punishment was not going to be increased. So you have to be asking, why, right? Why find him guilty but then stick with the lighter sentence? This is what's called the ratio decidendi in the legal world. It's the core reason for a court's decision. Let's get into it. First, let's talk about the conviction itself. The Supreme Court, just like the trial court before it, just wasn't buying the defendant's story. His alibi about being a tinsmith in another town, they saw it as just a mere denial that couldn't stand up against the witnesses the prosecution brought forward. And this is the key to understanding the sentence. This quote right from the Supreme Court's decision says it all. They're basically saying, look, while we're convinced he committed treasonous acts, the prosecution never proved that he was involved in anyone getting killed or disappearing. And that lack of proof was everything. It's why they refused to increase his sentence. So, what's the big takeaway from all this? What does this 70-year-old case teach us? Let's talk about the legal doctrines, the key principles that this case really cemented. At its very core, treason has two parts that have to be proven. First, you have to show adherence to the enemy, meaning loyalty to them. And second, you have to prove rendering aid and comfort. The court found that Villanueva's actions, like leading that pro-Japanese group, checked both of those boxes. So this case really hammers home a few big ideas. First, that citizens owe allegiance to their country. Second, that doing something like forming a pro-enemy group absolutely counts as treason. But maybe the most important point is that last one. The punishment for treason can be directly tied to the proven harm the person caused. No proof of direct harm could mean a less severe penalty. So let's just do a quick recap of how this case moved through the system. You see a consistent guilty verdict across the board, but the real debate was over the penalty. And in the end, the Supreme Court struck a balance, basing its final ruling very carefully on the specific evidence that was and was not presented. And so, in the end, the Supreme Court's final order, what's known as the disposition, was simple and direct. The original decision stands. And just like that, the long legal battle for Aquilino Villanueva was over. And that leaves us with this final thought, a question that's just as relevant today as it was back in 1953. How does a justice system punish betrayal when it can't prove the full extent of the damage done? It's a tough, fundamental question that courts still struggle with.